and then share my screen. Okay, yeah, so thanks for coming along. So this is a Chamber of Devon and Plymouth Chamber of Commerce and Rec Revita partnership. This is workshop 4, all about carbon net zero and how to do that, specifically focused on small to medium-sized businesses. Obviously, that's the majority of the companies which Devon and Plymouth Chamber of Commerce support. So yeah, that's generally been the focus. And as I say, we'll go through a little bit of summary of previous sessions now, and then get into the new content. So first stumbling block is it's not quite working on the slide deck. So there we are, it's a little bit of a delay. So to say, that's a synopsis of the previous sessions. My name's Darren Peck. I run a consultancy called Rec Revita. You see in the background, that's our logo. And we focus on providing consultancy services, focused around the 3 core tenets that we have at the business of sustainability, well-being, and personal development, and trying to hit the middle of that triangle. And as part of our service offering, obviously sustainability, this is where this session falls into. And say, we are a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and that's why we're partnering up with them on this session. So yeah, today we'll run through the previous 3, and then we'll talk about how to implement on your strategy, and then what sort of a few tips and tricks on what you can do to keep your momentum, and then talk about offsetting and the pros and cons of that, and then signpost you to some follow-on support. So we keep to time. I'll generally probably take questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have about a 15-minute period at the end. But yeah, hopefully should cover all your questions before we get to that. So on to the recap. To say, that is the YouTube link there for the first session, so you can go and peruse that at your leisure. So carbon footprinting essentially is the amount of carbon dioxide emissions released from your company's your organization's activities, which is split out through 3 different scopes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that is obviously benchmarked against carbon. Carbon is essentially emitted from the burning of fossil fuels, so non-renewable power. And the carbon dioxide element is used as a baseline for that. So the carbon baseline of 1 is given, and then these additional GHGs or greenhouse gases are equivalent benchmark to that. So sometimes obviously you get people making sort of funny references to cows and how they're bad for the environment. That's why sort of methane has a higher global warming potential from the gas released than carbon, but obviously there's less generally released. That's why there's always a sort of focus on carbon and carbon net zero. And then you've got some of the refrigerant gases down the bottom, which obviously have huge effects, but are fairly limited in their use now. So say, moving on to the sort of carbon scopes. So you've got scopes 1, 2, and 3, and the general dominance of any organization's biggest carbon impact generally sits in the scope 3, from the value chain or supply chain elements of that. So scope 1, emissions under your control. So essentially any assets owned by the company, that be vehicles, buildings, and then, as I say, any output from that. So yeah, any gas boilers, company-owned vehicles, so their fuel use, and then yeah, refrigerant losses as well. So that's the scope 1 element. Fairly easy for a company to manage and report on. And then scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity, and that is if you're on a non-renewable tariff, so you get your fuel, the fuel source for that energy generated is on the from non-renewable sources, essentially. So any gas, coal, etc. And then moving on to say the scope 3 emissions. Hopefully this is going to catch up. So there we are. Sorry to skip the slide. So scope 3, all other emissions from sources you don't own or control. So essentially, I think it's an American term, sort of value chain, or more commonly used in the UK supply chain. So that's a few of the different elements of there, and you can see that there's obviously different facets to that, which we'll touch upon again later on in the session. So the carbon policy, carbon workshop 2 that which we delivered, again, there's a link, and that focused on your carbon policy. So carbon policy is essentially, it's a communication of your organization's stance with relation to carbon. So what you're doing to essentially alleviate carbon from your organization's operations. Generally, most companies will have their own carbon policy, but sometimes it can be included in your environmental policy. There's no preference on that. Sometimes people like to have that on a one pager from as a carbon policy or environment policy. So yeah, there's no priority on that, but it's just differences in the way that's presented. So what should your carbon policy contain? So it should be sort of number based. It should have an empirical target against it, time based, and as you move around to sort of the bottom part of that diagram, you should use a standard metric, such as an ISO standard or a British standard. It should be baseline against a year, a standard year of operation, and then when you get towards the top end of the scale, it should be assessed externally, and ideally using sort of things like science-based targets. So why should you create one? Essentially, there are a lot of benefits to your organization, be it protection from future legislation, future resilience of your business, enhanced public reputation. There's a lot of industry metrics now placing companies which have a better track record with regards to corporate social responsibility. They actually perform better in business, relevant what area of operation or sector that they operate in, and increase competitiveness from drive down sort of in cost, and then additional sort of more less linked to what you would associate with carbon is essentially staff retention and attraction. A lot of research into sort of behaviours and sort of selection on companies from when people decide to move companies or take out new jobs. There's a lot of assessment into people selecting companies based on their sort of moral compass. So yeah, lots of additional benefits in there for setting your carbon policy and having a clear policy on that. So this is sort of a good summary table of the levels of your carbon policy. So like I was saying at the start, having sort of set targets on there, so it's a level 3, and then moving around to sort of following formal standards to level 5, and then again sort of top tier is having that accredited and externally assessed and accredited by another organization. So then, as say, we moved on to the carbon reduction strategy, which was the last session about 3 weeks ago. And so the intent of a carbon reduction strategy is to communicate your organization's actions to ensure commitments outlined in your carbon policy. Sometimes the carbon policy will form part of the carbon reduction strategy. Sometimes you have that as a separate document. But essentially, the carbon reduction strategy is how you're going to go about doing what you say you will do in that carbon policy. So it can be a formal document. It can be just sort of set from your standard. Ideally, it needs to be clearly communicated in a strategy, but it's not necessarily a requirement. So setting your strategy, as I say, a lot of people probably are familiar with SMART analogy, so I'm not going to go through that. But essentially, you need to assign responsibility to someone and who has an appropriate level of authority. So generally, that will be someone in a sort of senior leadership team position. So maybe like a CEO or something like that. And generally, they will sign to say that they will deliver on that carbon net zero strategy. So when you link in that to things like your environment management systems under ISO, so ISO 14001, senior leadership management and commitment to continual improvement are key facets of that. So these sort of will complement. So the carbon reduction strategies will complement some of these other standards that or certification scheme which you sign up to. So a little bit element of the detail of setting your strategy. So sort of this is just a fictitious snapshot of what you might want to be doing, and setting out sort of roles and responsibilities, having regular meetings, particularly at an operational level and also at a senior leadership management level, so that there's sort of a breadth and depth to some of that KPI tracking or management of the carbon policy, and the carbon strategy. So yeah, and putting, I say, time against that, so people are sort of working to clear parameters and timelines. So yeah, moving on to scope 3, as I say, we were speaking about that before. Essentially, scope 3 is the value chain. So there's 15 determinants, 15 elements to a carbon scope 3 carbon analysis. You've got your upstream, which is essentially cradle to gate, so anything that's in the manufacture or building or creation of a product or service. And then you've got your downstream activities, which are related to once that product leaves the organization's boundary. So that also includes end of life, as you can see in the bottom of here. So, and then whether or not that becomes a closed loop, so a recycled product or reconstituted into a new product, or that then goes to landfill. So yeah, there's a lot of elements to scope 3, which is why it's generally the least well reported, and a lot of companies only report against carbon scope 1 and scope 2 at the moment, but that's rapidly changing when companies are looking to be a lot more transparent and have a lot more of a competitive edge in the marketplace by being so. So again, upstream versus downstream. Say upstream is sort of cradle to gate, as the term is, material acquisition, pre-processing, and then you have your production element, and then distribution, storage, use, end of life is the downstream element to that. So again, definitions here with regards to that. I'm not going to go over that. Let's move this out of the way for purposes of the recording. See, yeah, you can see those. So yeah, taking into account, sort of picking some of these out. So category 1, purchase goods and services, is the largest factor in that scope 3 upstream element. And then with regards to fuel, that we cover category 3, but it would not be related to other elements. A big part of being clear and transparent with your carbon reporting is the boundaries of and where you've counted certain elements, because there are certain pinch points where it can be slightly ambiguous as to where you put some of your carbon. Would it be, for example, particularly in regards to vehicle ownership and employee / business travel / general operations of vehicular use? Obviously, generally that relates to only the and the fuel used in that use of those vehicles. Obviously, there's a embodied carbon that goes into, so the carbon which goes into creation of said vehicle, if that's a company vehicle, that was also counted as part of the overall carbon element. So you can see the complexity that lies within it. And then moving on to the downstream element. So yeah, more towards the sort of back end of business operations. So you can see on there the 15 sort of categories. So delivering on your strategy. So there are a few ways that you can do this, and I suggest you submit that into sort of short, medium, long term. Low cost and easy to implement, which sit in the short term, and that's things that you can do within the first sort of 6 months of deciding to enact on your sort of carbon net zero strategy or policy. So some of the sort of prompts for that, if you're starting out on your journey there. So a quick win would be, is the energy procured for your business sort of operations, whether that be a leased asset or your own buildings, is it on a green tariff? So a green tariff, I mean a renewable tariff. There's not a huge amount of renewable power generation in the UK network at the moment. It's probably sitting around in between 40 and 50%. So ideally you would be having those conversations now, because there's sort of a scramble to secure that element of the grid which is renewable. So that's a big one that you can do. But yeah, as I say, there's been a big push in the last 18 months, 2 years for people to start delivering on their carbon strategy, and this is one of the big ones that people have targeted, and therefore the amount of renewable energy that you can ring fence or claim as being a portion to your business is diminishing. So yeah, that's a quick one to do straight away. And then looking into things like energy use, or have you got meters, for example, on the water or energy in your company operation, and are they split meters? So are you having, for example, take a construction scenario, if you've got a construction site, have you got a meter for the site energy use, and have you then also got a meter for the welfare or the cabins or the offices which you reside in? So then you can look at implementing further down the line different strategies to try and reduce that energy use over time. And then yeah, a lot's obviously part of the new norm, utilizing sort of remote working methods. That is something that has been a positive to come out of COVID. Obviously not trivializing the huge negative impacts, but one positive that has come out of that is the embrace of working from home, the trust related to that, and the digital technology enhancements in business to allow that to happen. And then moving around to things like GPS systems. There's a lot of inaccuracies in GPS systems, particularly with regards to routing. So if your organization does a lot of deliveries, for example, just honing in on that GPS routing systems, and optimal routing is still something that can save a lot of fuel, for example. Other elements are which are pretty easy to implement. If you have the facilities like end-of-trip facilities, for example, at showers or things like that at your offices, is the green travel planning. So allowing sort of cycling predominantly, and then other elements of sort of multimodal transport or greener travel, such as train or things like that, to try and facilitate that in your business. And to say, not going to labor over the points on this one, but there's quite a few elements there that you can utilize. Just a slight segue. My company, Recorrido, is currently providing safety servicing and security tagging of bikes in order to help Plymouth City Council deliver on their sort of climate emergency strategy and get more people cycling, as opposed to using their personal sort of fossil fuel burning vehicles. So there's a suite of events which we're delivering across Plymouth across the summer period. So if you want to know more about that, you can go on our website. And yeah, the next one is at Lord Mayor's Day on Saturday. So we'll be in Lord Mayor's Day, and I'm a mile away from 10 till 4. So if anyone needs their bike serviced and security tagged for free, come on down and find us. So that's just a shameless sales pitch there, but we'll move on. So medium term, 6 to 24 months, requires a bit more investment and a bit more strategy behind it, and some small costs may be involved. So looking at potentially transitioning to at least some on-site renewable power generation, transitioning to other alternative sources of internal heating, for example, so ground source heat pumps, etc. Utilizing alternative fuels such as HVO fuel, so hydrotreated vegetable oil, as a transition. It's not the end solution, but it's a huge reduction in the carbon, and also the other sort of nasty gases like nitrogen oxide and things like that. So yeah, they're definitely good things to employ in a medium term sort of scenario. And then engaging with your value or supply chain. So are there any elements which you can switch out, such as reusable pallets, for example, for deliveries as opposed to sacrificial ones? That's a good quick one. Implementing sort of closed loop procurement, so making sure that materials or goods or services that you are procuring are readily recyclable and do go back into system, as opposed to utilizing sort of virgin products for the new product creation. And then looking at the buildings in which you reside, either from a lease or a own element. So sort of sustainable construction, retrofitting of buildings, employing the fabric first approach to sort of sustainable building use. So we'll move on to the sort of the longer term, again, potentially higher cost, more strategic, take quite a lot of time and effort to implement. So yeah, we've got potentially greening the fleet, so utilizing electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles potentially, localizing supply chain, making sure that you are using them within set parameters. So for example, 100 kilometers within the business operation for, I don't know, timber, for example, where that's procured from. I know that might be farmed elsewhere, but it's trying to localize that distribution network as much as possible. And then looking towards sort of redesign of product services, real sort of quite significant changes, but they could have a significant impact on the carbon, and then potential return on investments and business operations. So and then the biggest part of any organizations, as I'm sure a lot of you will be aware, is change in behaviors and the change in the personnel. So implementing behavioral training schemes is a big part of that transition. So section 3 then, moving around to keeping up momentum. So a big part of this, to say it again, is looking at the management. So say under ISO 40001, a big element of that is getting the senior leadership in any organization to buy into it and drive that, and then check in and manage those results. So for example, might be the frequency you might decide on having a senior leadership meeting might be quarterly or might be monthly, depending on sort of what size and scale of business and how you operate. And then looking for sort of those smart metrics or the smart goals that you've applied in your strategy. So those KPIs or key performance indicators, making sure that you're tracking against them and that they are stretch targets as opposed to something that you feel quite comfortable and that you are meeting. If you are meeting those sort of regularly, then you do need to refine them. But as I say, that all depends on sort of pre-work that you've done with regards to your carbon baselining, to your baseline year. Say, just to refresh on that, you could have a baseline of your carbon. It needs to be generally based upon 1 full year of operation. Could be from calendar year, could be from financial year, but essentially needs to be based on average year. So a lot of companies are still utilizing 2019 as their norm. Maybe 2022 will become a next year. Obviously, 2020 and 2021 were abnormal years in terms of business operation due to obviously the global pandemic. So a lot of companies are steering away from using that as a baseline year. But then as the business evolves, obviously you'll report against that baseline. But then it might be sort of 3, 4, 5 years down the line as your business evolves and grows, and you might need to re-baseline that because the business has changed its dynamic or pivoted into other areas. So yeah, continual improvement, as I say, and monitoring and tracking against that, and then updating your policy in a corresponding fashion. Generally, sort of a lot of corporate companies will have sort of 5-year sort of master plans or goals, and then they will deliver against that, and then have like yearly goals internally within the organization, which they will be working to achieve that 5-year aim. And then again, share results with your staff. You'd be amazed at how passionate some people can be. Maybe it's not their sort of daily job or their main function of their job, but they actually do love to get involved in elements of environment sustainability. There's a real passion for it, particularly around in the last sort of couple of years with a lot of sort of David Attenborough documentaries, with sort of plastic pollution and things like that. And it's generally grabbed a hold of people's attention and realised like how much of an impact that we're having on the environment. And yeah, people want to get involved and dedicate like sort of additional time on top of their role to doing that because they're so passionate about it. So yeah, get your staff involved, and then looking at sort of maybe incentivizing staff. So could you do anything around like active travel, green travel? If people are cycling into work, they maybe get an additional incentive from that. Obviously, aside from their own sort of saving on fuel costs, saving on sort of maintenance of things. So yeah, obviously with the energy and fuel crisis and the cost of living going up, a lot of people are deciding to utilize free or low cost travel methods like cycling, which is obviously fantastic. And then the additional benefit of that is that they get the exercise involved, and if maybe they're not as physically capable, the adoption of e-bikes are on a precipice of becoming mainstream. I think they are coming down in price. The Cycle to Work scheme recently upped their allowance from 1,000 to 2,500 to adopt low-level e-bikes. So e-bikes now are, and also sort of cargo bikes have come on a long way. So there's also cargo e-bikes, which you can get a lot of sort of good materials things. So there's a lot of companies now who are utilizing e-bikes as part of their business operation, and similarly people using them to even take small children around and things like that. So yeah, they are becoming a lot more mainstream and a lot more viable methods of transport. So so yeah, and then moving on to say monitoring, measuring and managing the data. So you can't manage what you don't monitor. So essentially that data, like I was saying, split meters or tracking against your KPIs, making sure that you've got good data from the supply chain, for example, connecting up that supply chain on sort of products or services that you're using. Generally, a lot of organisations now have sort of woken up to this, so they will be probably doing their own reporting themselves. They'll probably be more than happy to share a lot of information as long as it doesn't give off like sort of competitive. It doesn't have competitive complications or commercial complications. Generally, a lot of companies will have teams dedicated to this now. That's another key point as well. Actually dedicating a person to a role. I know sort of some of the smaller companies might not be able to have dedicated full-time resource on things like sustainability or environment, but with those sorts of organisations, maybe you could combine a suitably qualified person in a HSE role, so health, safety, environment role, but making sure that they are competent in the E element. There's a lot of health and safety environment practitioners which are very competent in health and safety, but the environment side is a little bit weak. So making sure you've got that rounded element if you are deciding to go for a resource which is split between those disciplines. And then, yeah, sort of keeping on track using your assured systems such as your environment management system, ISO 14001. They can be real tools in delivering on your carbon net zero strategy. So yeah, that's a big part of it as well. So moving on to sort of carbon offsetting and carbon capture. So just as we step into that sphere again, we'll look at the differences in carbon terms. So carbon neutral, obviously a term bandied around quite a lot. It doesn't particularly have massive amounts of benefit anymore, simply because of the fact that you're not required to have a reduction. So you can essentially you can offset a lot of your business operation and still be defined as carbon neutral. Essentially, you offset the same amount of the carbon that you put into the environment. Obviously now net zero has sort of become the buzzword, so reduce as much as possible, and then balancing with residual offsets, ideally on site, but can be off site if you don't have the space. And then, yeah, net positive, again, offset more than you actually put into the environment, which is now becoming the sort of market differentiator there. So yeah, again, carbon offsets, a reduction or removal of emissions to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. So yeah, I don't know if people are familiar with carbon offsetting schemes, but yeah, things like Trees for Life, Woodland Trust, essentially setting up dedicated woodlands and planting trees. Now there's a lot more focus on sort of the green, the blue sort of carbon sequestration or offsetting. So like things like seagrass or peatlands or things like that. So that's sort of becoming a bigger element of that. So yeah, it's maybe another alternative scheme which could be more local to where you operate as a business. And then a little bit sort of on the standards, there are different standards. So the gold standard for carbon offsetting, we can have that again verified. Key points here, they should be additional to any other things that you've got going on within the sort of environment sustainability element of your business. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with the new environment bill, which essentially states that any new development has to have a 10% biodiversity net gain. I wouldn't say that you would or should count any sort of carbon offsettings by sort of tree planting, etc., within that carbon, within that biodiversity net gain 10% of your site footprint, because I think that would be essentially negating the positive. It would essentially be a double count. So yeah, that moves on to like not overestimating the amount. So an example of that would be if you are offsetting off site and you plant a load of trees, those trees, depending on the type and nature of them, will not start to take carbon out of the atmosphere or have a significant impact on that carbon reduction in the atmosphere until they reach maturity, which sometimes can be 15 years down the line. So it's important to check that when you are signing up to these schemes, whether or not it's a carbon reduction now or a future carbon reduction. So that's big part of it. And then permanent, not installing sort of temporary living walls or green roofs or things like that you count sort of building handover, and then if they're not well maintained, obviously die back or things like that, then you can't really continue to count that. So and then like I was talking about earlier, there is a big element of potential double counting and potential crossover in the carbon scope 3. So making sure that you're clear and transparent with your value chain, your supply chain, who's counting what and where the boundaries are, and making sure that you report that in your sort of carbon net zero strategies. So and then the final part would probably be regards to ESG, so environment, social governance, making sure that sort of social sustainability element is not impacted, for example. So if you are using an offsetting scheme, that companies maybe making sure that they're not utilising sort of workers who are working below the living wage or below the minimum wage in that environment, which happens a lot more than you probably would understand. So just making sure that the schemes that you're buying into are verified. They are sort of industry leading, and they are sort of watertight from that ESG perspective. So just sort of hitting home the point, avoid the greenwashing element. So like I was saying about the carbon reporting of when you use for example, an offsetting scheme, making sure that offsets are part of the wider reduction strategy, and the reduction element is the key part, and then being clear on your parameters of your reporting. So say there's two providers that I have used in the past, generally basis upon sort of for example, Trees for Life. I think the metric is a 5 meter square area of a building footprint. For example, if you wanted to offset 10% of that building, you would buy an equivalent 5 meter square area of a woodland, which is generally a new planted woodland up in Scotland. I think Trees for Life is based. And then you get like a certificate and your own grove. So my old company Mace, we used to have a Mace Grove up in Scotland. And you can verify that as well to make sure they're not sort of double counting theirs and selling the same plot to 10 companies, for example. Again, understanding when the offset is valid, that's a key point. And then thinking outside the box. So say blue carbon capture, seagrass, mangroves, peatlands, those sorts of elements are equally as important. Maybe not some of them are visually stimulating or seen as the sort of picture postcard element that you maybe want to use for your marketing, but they are equally as valid. And there's a lot more, particularly with regards to Plymouth and sort of the marine, the Plymouth Sound, and the push for the marine park. They could be good options to invest in locally, and they can obviously have an additional benefit if you are operating within the Plymouth or Devon area. So moving on to sort of the carbon capture and storage. Science still a little bit inconclusive. Obviously, going through an industrial process to try and extract carbon from the environment is still quite new technology. It's costly, and potentially the impact of all of that embodied carbon, the operation from sequestering that carbon from the environment, taking it out mechanically or in an assured process, is still a little bit inconclusive. It's quite risky, quite costly. So at this point, I don't think the evidence is strong enough to say that is a good viable alternative The more natural based solutions like planting of trees and woodlands are probably preferred at this stage, in my opinion. So that kind of comes to the end of the session. Probably went through that a little bit quickly, but I wanted to leave some time at the back end for comments and questions. This is a signpost on to what we can do at Recravida. So some elements there, green building certifications, for example, sustainability training. We can sort of tailor this a lot to the business sort of size and need. We are a Devon Chamber of Commerce member, so we'd like to try and keep fellow members in with sort of discounts, etc. So yeah, and as I say, don't just do the sustainability piece, you also do sort of well-being, sort of fit well and well-building assessor as well, from the sort of indoor operational environment, and also do sort of well-being coaching, and also personal development, life skills coaching, career coaching sessions, things like that. So yeah, reach out if you need any of those. These are all the workshops. Say they're linked there, and then this one will be probably 2-3 weeks time. This one will also be up on YouTube, and then following onto the chamber, so the Net Zero Hub and the directory there. There's a wealth of resources on there, so do check that out. And then that forms the Q&A section. So yeah, has anyone got any questions? All right, we've got some in the chat, so let's have a look at this. Apologies, I didn't see them. How do you see EVs fitting in for business travel? Electric vehicles, obviously the push is for 2030, I believe, off the top of my head. At the moment, I think a lot of companies are sort of on that sort of knife edge between being leading edge and being bleeding edge. The rate of install of electric vehicle charging points has been sort of inadequate in the last say 5 to 10 years. A lot of new planning requirements coming through are actually mandating that for both for domestic and business related sort of planning, which is a good thing, I think, because it's sort of the chicken and egg scenario. In terms of business travel, it depends on your sort of organizational setup, but there are some business operations that are more suitable towards electric vehicles. For example, bus companies, delivery companies which operate within a sort of small geographic area. Yeah, so there are lots of those benefits. I think the sort of race for the perfect sort of alternative fuel is sort of still going on. Hydrogen is obviously one viable alternative, but yeah, I mean the raw earth minerals which you need for electric vehicles are actually quite bad for the environment, particularly from environment social governments. A lot of that material is mined in sort of poor conditions in sort of Western Africa and other places like that. So yeah, the EV element is not really sort of the silver bullet at the moment that we maybe think it might be. But yeah, for specific companies with set parameters, I think they can be an asset. But yeah, just not company. Does that answer your question, Catherine?
That's really useful, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'll move on to this next one. Are you planning for climate risks, weather-related shocks do not affect business corporations? Yeah, as I say, climate resilience is sort of being factored in to a lot of company organizations now at an increasing rate. The UK is predicted to become a water scarce country in 2050, as shocking as that be to a lot of people. 1 in 9 litres of water pumped in the UK is lost through leaks, and yeah, the capture of water, for example. So that is a distinct risk in the near future. And other things like, for example, I work at Devonport, and the sorry about that, and the design elements are factoring in sort of rise of sea levels and things like that, because it is a distinct opportunity, a distinct threat now. So yeah, there are a lot of sort of modeling and risk analysis that goes in now, and it is very much sort of around the corner, as opposed to in the future now. So yeah, it's a big topic, but yeah, generally it should be factored in. It should be on risk registers now in your organization. It should be, yeah, being looked at quite heavily. Costs for offsets, I think Trees for Life, for example, they were quoting around, I think it was around a £50 per 25 meters, or is it five? I think it's £25 for 5 meter square offset. So not huge, but again, that should be the last resort.
And how much carbon is that offsetting? How much carbon is that offsetting? And do you have to wait the 15 years until it gets to till it starts actually sequestering carbon? Or is that
Well, it depends on, I think you can buy future credits. I think they'll probably be at a cheaper rate, because they're obviously struggling to keep up with demand at the moment. If you were to buy mature, they'd obviously be more expensive. I don't know the figure for the, because obviously it depends on every type of tree, where they're located, for the different schemes. But yeah, it does have a significant impact. But yeah, as I say, offset should be sort of the last resort in that puzzle. And then how do you pick a best offset system or scheme? Let's say the best is always local. That's generally the approach in ESG, keeping things local in that supply chain. And then yeah, ideally on site. That's the sort of hierarchy: on site if you can, and then off site but local, and then off site sort of further afield. An accredited scheme that is, yeah, maybe having systems like ISO 40001, or for regards to carbon, utilizing science-based targets. So yeah, there's a few parameters which can help you make that decision. But yeah, there's quite a few schemes out there, obviously, in the recent years. But like any new industry, there are a lot of unprofessional, shall I say, operators in the industry who maybe put some bold claims in there. So yeah. Okay, any further questions? No. Okay, so
I've got one quick question. Sorry, I'm just really interested. That should probably say nosy. Really, what sector's everyone from? What businesses you're in? I'm really keen to see, you know, who's leading the way locally.
So Kyra's from the chamber. Not sure on anyone else. Yeah, I didn't get the run sheet this time, so I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, we might do some sort of analytics of who's from what. But yeah, maybe everyone's a little bit shy today. I work at Devonport as well. I'm for Babcock, so this is sort of on top of my day job at the moment. We'll see what happens with it. We're only 6 months in, so we'll see how we get on. But okay, well, unless anyone's got any further questions, we'll call the session to a close and I'll stop recording.